There are moments in history when the universe seems to align with perfect precision, when the mathematics of existence arranges itself into patterns so elegant they feel almost intentional. On January 8, 1942, exactly 300 years to the day after Galileo Galilei drew his final breath in Italy, a child was born in Oxford, England. The symmetry is remarkable. Both men would transform how humanity perceives the cosmos. Both would do so while their bodies betrayed them. And both would prove that physical limitation cannot cage a mind determined to reach the stars. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Outside, German bombs were falling on London. The Luftwaffe's campaign to break Britain's spirit sent families scrambling into underground shelters night after night, the earth trembling with each distant explosion. But Oxford had been granted an unofficial exemption from the bombing raids, a peculiar arrangement born from mutual academic respect. The Germans would spare Oxford's ancient universities if the British spared Heidelberg and Göttingen. Even in war, knowledge held a sacred status. So it was in this bubble of relative safety that Frank Hawking, a medical researcher specializing in tropical diseases, and Isabel Hawking, a philosophy student turned secretary, welcomed their first child into a world tearing itself apart. They named him Stephen William Hawking. The house where young Stephen grew up in Highgate, North London, was extraordinary in its eccentricity. Imagine a Victorian structure slowly surrendering to entropy, its walls lined with books stacked in precarious towers, its basement housing a hive of bees that Frank kept for honey, its greenhouse sheltering experimental plants. The family car was a converted London taxi, a choice both economical and conspicuously unconventional. At dinner, while other families discussed the weather or neighbourhood gossip, the Hawkings debated the structure of atoms, the nature of consciousness, the possibility of life beyond Earth. This was not a typical childhood. This was an education in thinking differently. Frank Hawking was methodical, precise, a scientist who brought his laboratory discipline home. Isabel was philosophical, questioning, forever probing beneath surface answers to find deeper truths. Between them, they created an environment where curiosity wasn't just encouraged, but expected, where asking why was never met with dismissal, where the dinner table became a forum for intellectual exploration that most children never experience until university, if ever. But here's what fascinates me most about young Stephen's early years. He couldn't read until he was 8 years old. 8. In an era when reading by age 6 was expected, when his younger sister Mary was already devouring books, Stephen struggled with the symbols on the page. His teachers worried. His parents noticed but didn't panic. And Stephen himself seemed unbothered by what others perceived as a deficiency. Because while his reading lagged, his mathematical intuition soared. Consider what this tells us about intelligence. We often measure genius by how quickly a child masters conventional skills, how early they read, how fast they calculate. But Stephen's mind was busy constructing something far more sophisticated than literacy. He was building spatial reasoning, visualizing problems in 3 dimensions, developing an intuitive grasp of mathematics that didn't require symbols on paper. His brain was wiring itself for physics, for cosmology, for understanding the universe's deepest structures. When reading finally clicked for him, it wasn't a struggle overcome through drilling or tutoring. It simply happened as if his brain had been waiting for the right moment, as if it had been too busy with more important development to bother with something as trivial as decoding words. By age 9, his schoolwork remained persistently mediocre. His handwriting was famously atrocious. His teachers at Street, Albans School, where the family had moved, ranked him in the bottom third of his class. One report card noted with concern that he seemed unable to keep his work tidy or complete assignments on time. Another teacher wrote that young Stephen showed little promise for advanced studies. How magnificently wrong they were, because outside of formal schoolwork, Stephen's mind was operating on an entirely different level. With a group of similarly curious friends, he spent months constructing a computer from recycled clock parts, telephone switchboard components, and other mechanical salvage. This was 1958. Commercial computers filled entire rooms and cost fortunes. These teenagers built one in a bedroom, not from a kit or instructions, but from first principles, from understanding how logic gates worked, how electrical circuits could perform calculations. They called it LUCE, the Logical Uniselector Computing Engine. It couldn't do much by modern standards. It solved simple mathematical equations. But that's not what mattered. What mattered was that a 16-year-old boy had looked at the problem of computation and thought, I can build that. What mattered was the ambition to create rather than consume, to understand systems so deeply that they could be reconstructed from scraps. This is where genius reveals itself, not in test scores or tidy notebooks, but in the audacity to attempt what seems impossible. Stephen's father Frank had clear plans for his son's future. Medicine, follow the family path, use that brilliant mind to heal bodies, to cure diseases, to continue Frank's work in tropical medicine. It was a practical career, respected, financially stable. Frank had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to see his son chase something as impractical as theoretical physics. But Stephen had no interest in medicine. The human body, for all its complexity, felt too small, too limited. He wanted to understand everything, the entire universe, how it began, how it would end, why it existed at all. He told his father during one heated discussion, "But the universe is everything." This single statement reveals so much about how Stephen's mind worked. Most physicists of that era were obsessed with particle physics, with smashing atoms apart to discover quarks and bosons and ever smaller constituents of matter. It was the frontier of physics, where Nobel Prizes were being won, where careers were being made. Stephen looked at this frontier and found it insufficiently ambitious. He wanted the biggest questions, the ultimate questions. Why does the universe exist? Did it have a beginning? Will it have an end? What are space and time? Are they fundamental, or do they emerge from something deeper? These weren't questions that practical-minded Frank could easily support. These were questions that might never be answered. These were questions that led to philosophy as much as physics, to contemplation rather than concrete results. But Stephen was immovable. He would study cosmology or nothing. In 1959, he won a scholarship to University College, Oxford, his father's alma mater. Frank had hoped Oxford would instill some practical discipline, would steer Stephen toward chemistry or biology, something useful. Instead, Oxford confirmed everything Stephen already knew about himself. He was bored. Oxford's physics curriculum felt pedestrian to a mind already operating at the edges of known science. The material was too easy. The pace was too slow. Stephen attended perhaps 1,000 hours of lectures during his 3 years at Oxford, and later estimated he worked only an hour per day on average. For the final exams that would determine his future, he studied physics for approximately 15 hours total. This wasn't arrogance or laziness. This was a mind so far beyond the material that engaging with it felt like asking an Olympic sprinter to practice walking. But here's what's remarkable. Despite his minimal effort, despite his obvious disengagement, Stephen's brilliance couldn't be completely hidden. His tutors recognized something extraordinary, even if they couldn't quantify it. On his final exams, his scores placed him on the border between a first-class and second-class honours degree. The difference would determine whether he could pursue graduate studies at Cambridge, whether he could continue in physics at all. The Oxford dons called him in for an oral examination. For 1 hour, they questioned him about physics, about problems and theories and possibilities, and in that hour, Stephen showed them what he'd been hiding behind mediocre coursework and minimal attendance. He showed them a mind that didn't just understand physics, but could dance with it, play with it, recombine it into new configurations. They awarded him the first-class degree. He was going to Cambridge. But let me tell you about Stephen's social life at Oxford, because it reveals something essential about who he was becoming. He joined the rowing club, not as a rower but as a coxswain, the small person who sits at the stern and shouts commands while the larger athletes row. It was perfect for his slight build, his unathleticism, his preference for strategy over physical strength. And he was good at it, reckless, aggressive, willing to risk collisions and damage to gain seconds, but undeniably good. His crews won races. Other coxswains respected his tactical sense even as they questioned his sanity. Stephen brought to rowing what he brought to physics: a complete disregard for conventional caution, a willingness to push right to the edge of disaster because that's where the interesting things happened. He had friends. He went to parties. He listened to classical music and Wagner and debated philosophy over too many drinks. He seemed, to casual observation, like a typical Oxford student enjoying the privilege of elite education. But inside, questions were accumulating. Questions about the universe's origins. Questions about black holes, those mysterious collapsed stars where gravity became so intense that not even light could escape. Questions about whether Einstein's general theory of relativity, which had stood for decades as physics' most elegant achievement, might be incomplete. When Stephen arrived at Cambridge in October 1962 to begin his doctorate, he had one clear goal: work with the famous cosmologist Fred Hoyle, whose steady-state theory of the universe was locked in heated battle with the emerging Big Bang theory. Hoyle was brilliant, charismatic, famous. Working with him would mean joining cosmology's most exciting debates, but Cambridge had other plans. Stephen was assigned to Dennis Sciama, a younger physicist who lacked Hoyle's fame, but possessed something more valuable: the ability to ask questions that hadn't been asked yet. It was Sciama who directed Stephen's attention to Roger Penrose's recent work on gravitational collapse. Penrose had used sophisticated mathematics called topology to prove something shocking. When a massive star exhausts its fuel and collapses, general relativity predicts that all its matter must be crushed into a single point of infinite density. A singularity, not as a mathematical curiosity or theoretical possibility, but as an absolute inevitability. If Penrose was right, then the universe contained places where physics, as we understood it, simply stopped working, where all the equations broke down, where space and time themselves became meaningless. Stephen read Penrose's work and saw something that no one else had quite grasped. If gravitational collapse inevitably created singularities in black holes, then running time backward, the entire universe's expansion must have emerged from a singularity. The Big Bang wasn't just an explosion in space, it was an explosion of space itself, emerging from a point where nothing that came before could have any meaning. This was the question that would define Stephen's early career. This was the seed that would grow into the singularity theorems, mathematical proofs that would force physicists to accept that the universe had a definite beginning, that time itself had a starting point. But here's what makes Stephen's journey so remarkable. He arrived at Cambridge with burning questions and fierce ambition, ready to solve the universe's deepest mysteries. He had finally escaped Oxford's tedium, had finally found a place where his questions weren't too big or too impractical. He was 20 years old, brilliant, positioned at the cutting edge of cosmology. And then everything changed. One afternoon, walking across Cambridge's cobblestones, Stephen stumbled. It wasn't a trip over an uneven stone. It was a collapse, his legs suddenly refusing commands, his body crumpling. He caught himself, stood up, brushed it off. An anomaly. Probably just fatigue. But it kept happening. His hands began fumbling simple tasks. His speech occasionally slurred. Something was systematically dismantling the connection between his brilliant mind and his increasingly uncooperative body. The universe had given Stephen Hawking the questions he'd spent his whole life preparing to answer. The universe had positioned him at the exact right place and time to revolutionize physics. The universe had assembled all the pieces for an extraordinary career. And now the universe was taking his body away. What Stephen didn't yet know, couldn't yet know, was that this betrayal would transform him from a brilliant physicist into something else entirely. Something unprecedented. That losing his body would somehow sharpen his mind to impossible focus. That his physical limitations would force him to develop ways of thinking about physics that no one had attempted before. The stumble on those Cambridge stairs was the beginning of the end of Stephen's old life. But it was also, though he couldn't see it yet, the beginning of something extraordinary. A race against time, a battle between biological decay and cosmic discovery. And the universe itself, it seemed, had placed a bet on which would win. The human body is an extraordinary collaboration of systems. 37 trillion cells working in concert, each performing its designated function with remarkable precision. Neurons fire electrical signals at speeds up to 268 miles per hour, carrying thoughts from brain to muscle, intention to action. It's a system so reliable that we rarely consider it, taking for granted that when we decide to walk, our legs obey. When we choose to speak, our vocal cords respond, until they don't. For Stephen Hawking, the unraveling began so gradually that at first it seemed like nothing at all. A stumble here, a slurred word there, the kind of minor malfunctions that healthy 21-year-olds dismiss as fatigue or clumsiness or too many late nights studying physics. But the incidents accumulated. His handwriting, already notoriously poor, became increasingly illegible. Climbing stairs required concentration. His mother Isabel noticed during Christmas break in 1962 that something was wrong, something beyond her son's usual awkwardness. She insisted he see a doctor. What followed was 2 years of medical limbo, a descent into diagnostic uncertainty that might have broken a lesser spirit. The doctors at Cambridge poked and prodded, ran tests that revealed nothing definitive. They watched his symptoms progress but couldn't name what they were watching. Stephen underwent a muscle biopsy, a procedure that involves inserting a needle deep into tissue to extract samples for analysis. He spent 2 weeks in the hospital undergoing examination after examination, each one more invasive than the last. And then they found it. Or rather, they found its signature, the unmistakable pattern of motor neuron destruction. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS. In Britain, they called it motor neurone disease. In America, it would become known as Lou Gehrig's disease, named for the baseball player who died from it in 1941. The name doesn't matter. The mechanism is always the same. The motor neurons that carry signals from brain to muscle begin to die. The muscles, receiving no instructions, atrophy. The mind remains perfectly intact, perfectly aware, trapped inside a body that's systematically shutting down. There is no cure. There has never been a cure. The progression is typically swift and merciless. The doctors gave Stephen 2 years to live. Perhaps a bit more if he was lucky, but almost certainly not 5. He was 21 years old, just beginning his doctorate, just starting to ask the questions about the universe that he'd spent his whole life preparing to explore. 2 years. Try to imagine receiving that prognosis. Try to imagine being told that your body has already begun the process of dying, that the countdown has started, that everything you plan to accomplish must be compressed into 24 months or forgotten forever. Most people would crumble. Most people would rage or despair or simply give up. Because why pursue a doctorate you'll never finish? Why start work you'll never complete? Stephen fell into a depression so deep that he stopped attending lectures, stopped working on his research, stopped seeing friends. He spent his days in his room listening to Wagner, particularly the Götterdämmerung, the Twilight of the Gods, as if scoring his own approaching end with appropriate dramatic intensity. He began drinking heavily, not from enjoyment but from a desire to blur the edges of consciousness, to make the waiting more bearable. His dreams became strange and recurrent. He dreamed he was going to be executed. He dreamed he might sacrifice his own life if his death could save others. He dreamed he was trying to help people, to do something meaningful before the end came. These weren't nightmares exactly. They were his subconscious processing the impossible situation, trying to find meaning in meaninglessness, purpose in approaching oblivion. And then he went to a party. New Year's 1963. Stephen's sister threw a small gathering, the kind of modest celebration that marks time's passage without making too much fuss about it. Stephen attended reluctantly, more from habit than desire. He was still caught in depression's grip, still seeing no point in social niceties when death had already scheduled its appointment. At that party, he met Jane Wilde. She was 18 years old, studying languages at Westfield College, passionate about poetry and music and literature. She had brown hair and an infectious enthusiasm and absolutely no connection to physics or cosmology or the academic world that had consumed Stephen's entire life. She was, in every way, a glimpse of something beyond the equations that had defined his existence. They talked, and in talking, Stephen felt something shift, some locked mechanism inside him beginning to turn. Jane didn't know about his diagnosis at first. She just saw a brilliant, slightly awkward young man with intense eyes and a quick wit and ideas that tumbled out faster than his increasingly difficult speech could express them. She saw who he was, not what he was becoming. Over the following months, they began dating. Stephen told her about his condition, about the prognosis, about the inevitable decline ahead. Most people would have retreated from that revelation, would have protected themselves from the certain heartbreak of falling in love with someone carrying a terminal diagnosis. Jane didn't retreat. Here's what she said years later about that decision. I wanted to find some purpose to my existence, and I suppose I found it in the idea of looking after him. Because suddenly, Stephen had a reason to live beyond intellectual curiosity. He had a reason to fight the depression, to return to his research, to make the most of whatever time remained. If he was going to die, he would die having accomplished something. If these were his final years, he would spend them answering the universe's deepest questions. And he would spend them with Jane. They became engaged in October 1964, just months after his diagnosis was confirmed. The engagement was an act of defiance, a statement that love and purpose could exist even in the shadow of death. Stephen later said that getting engaged saved his life, gave him something to live for, transformed the terminal diagnosis from an ending into a beginning. And then something extraordinary happened, something that medical science still cannot fully explain. Stephen's disease stopped progressing so rapidly. The decline that should have killed him within 2 years slowed to a crawl. His symptoms continued, yes. His mobility decreased gradually, his speech became more difficult, His dependence on others increased year by year, but the swift death sentence became a chronic condition. The 2 years became 5, then 10, then 20. It's as if the universe looked at Stephen Hawking and decided, "Not yet. You're not finished yet. Now, let me be clear. I'm not suggesting supernatural intervention or divine providence. I'm a naturalist, a man of science. But I am suggesting something that defies our current medical understanding of ALS. The typical progression from diagnosis to death is 2 to 5 years. Stephen would live 55 more years. His variant of ALS progressed at roughly 1/10 the normal speed, creating a unique situation in medical literature. Why? We don't know. Perhaps his early onset ALS follows different rules than the typical late onset form. Perhaps some genetic factor provided protection we haven't identified. Perhaps the sheer force of his determination to continue working somehow influenced his body's trajectory in ways we can't measure. Or perhaps, sometimes, the universe needs certain minds to complete certain work, and it finds a way to preserve them long enough to finish. Watch what happened next. With engagement giving him purpose and his disease mysteriously stabilizing, Stephen threw himself into his research with focused intensity. He couldn't waste time. He couldn't afford to pursue dead ends or conventional problems. He needed to attack the biggest questions in cosmology, to make discoveries that mattered, to compress an entire career into whatever time remained. Working with Roger Penrose, he began developing the mathematical proofs that would become known as the singularity theorems. These weren't simple calculations. They were sophisticated geometric arguments using topology, a branch of mathematics that studies properties preserved under continuous deformation. Penrose had proven that collapsing stars must form singularities. Stephen extended this logic backward in time to the universe itself. If you run the universe's expansion backward, if you rewind the galaxies flying apart from each other, you reach a point where all matter and energy occupied the same location. Not a very small space, but a point of zero size and infinite density, a singularity. And at that singularity, all the laws of physics break down, cease to have meaning. This was revolutionary. The steady-state theory that Fred Hoyle championed, which claimed the universe had no beginning and would have no end, suddenly faced mathematical proof of its impossibility. The universe had a beginning. Time itself had a starting point. Before that point, there was no before. Stephen completed his PhD thesis in 1965. The title was Properties of Expanding Universes, and it contained work that would influence cosmology for decades. He was 23 years old, recently married to Jane, alive far beyond his original prognosis, and already making fundamental contributions to physics. But here's what strikes me most about this period. Stephen's physical decline, rather than limiting his work, somehow enabled it. As his body became less capable of physical activity, his mind developed extraordinary powers of visualization. He couldn't easily write equations on paper anymore, couldn't manipulate mathematical symbols with a pen, so he learned to perform calculations entirely in his head, to visualize geometric structures in multiple dimensions, to manipulate abstract concepts without external aids. This forced him to think about physics differently than his peers. Where others relied on pages of algebraic manipulation, Stephen had to understand problems at a deeper, more intuitive level. He had to see the physics, not just calculate it. And this visual, geometric approach led him to insights that algebraic methods might never have revealed. Consider what this means. The very limitation that should have ended his career instead transformed how he worked, pushed him to develop cognitive strategies that gave him unique advantages. The tragedy became, in a strange way, an asset. Jane and Stephen married in July 1965 at the chapel of Trinity Hall in Cambridge. She was 21, he was 23, and using a cane to walk. The photographs from that day show a young couple beaming at each other, radiant with possibility despite the shadow of his diagnosis. Jane wore a traditional white dress. Stephen wore a dark suit and a smile of genuine joy. They honeymooned in Suffolk, at a seaside cottage, and began building a life together against astronomical odds. Their first child, Robert, was born in 1967. Stephen could still walk with assistance then, could still hold his son, though the grip was weak and required Jane's help. Their daughter Lucy followed in 1969, and their third child, Timothy, in 1979. 3 children raised by a father who could not change diapers or help with homework or play catch in the yard, but who could share the wonder of the universe with them, who could show them that limitation is only limitation if you accept it as such. Jane became more than a wife. She became Stephen's primary caregiver, the coordinator of his medical needs, the translator when his speech became incomprehensible to others, the defender of his time and energy against the endless demands that would come later. She gave up her own academic ambitions to enable his. She bore the physical and emotional burden of his care while raising 3 children and trying to maintain some semblance of normal family life. The strain was immense. How could it not be? But during these early years, their relationship had a quality of partnership, of 2 people facing impossible circumstances together and refusing to surrender. Stephen's career accelerated. He became a Fellow of Gonville and Caius College in Cambridge, pronounce it Keys, giving him both security and resources. He collaborated with George Ellis on a textbook about the large-scale structure of space-time that became a foundation text in general relativity. His papers on cosmology began attracting serious attention from physicists worldwide, and through it all, his disease continued its mysterious, slow progression. By 1969, he needed a wheelchair. By the early 1970s, his speech had deteriorated enough that only those who knew him well could understand him clearly. His hands could no longer write equations, could barely manipulate objects, but his mind, his extraordinary mind, continued expanding, continued asking questions, continued seeing connections that others missed. Here's what Stephen said about those years. My expectations were reduced to 0 when I was 21. Everything since then has been a bonus. Do you hear the profound shift in that statement? When you expect nothing, when death has already claimed you in theory, every moment becomes precious. Every discovery becomes a gift. Every day survived becomes a victory. The fear of death that paralyzes so many people, that prevents us from taking risks or pursuing ambitious goals, had been inverted. Stephen had already been told he was dying. The fear had already happened, had already been processed and survived. What remained was clarity, focus, the liberation of having nothing left to lose. This is one of life's strangest paradoxes. Sometimes the worst thing that can happen to us becomes the catalyst for our greatest achievements. Sometimes limitation forces innovation. Sometimes the countdown clock makes every moment count in ways that immortality never could. By 1970, Stephen had defied his prognosis by 7 years and was just beginning the most productive period of his career. The work on singularities had established his reputation. The marriage to Jane had given him stability and purpose. The children had made the abstract fight for survival intensely personal. And ahead of him lay a discovery that would overturn everything physicists believed about the most mysterious objects in the universe. A discovery that would emerge not from expensive experiments or powerful telescopes, but purely from thought, from mathematical reasoning, from a mind that had learned to see the universe more clearly than eyes ever could. The boy given 2 years to live was about to prove that black holes, those cosmic prisons from which nothing can escape, aren't quite so black after all. Black holes are among the universe's most extreme creations. Imagine a star so massive that when it exhausts its nuclear fuel, no force in nature can prevent its collapse. The outer layers explode in a supernova, but the core implodes, crushed by its own gravity into a volume smaller than an atom. The density becomes infinite. The gravitational pull becomes so intense that space-time itself warps into a one-way trap. Nothing escapes. Not matter. Not light. Not even information about what fell in. This is why we call them black holes. They are cosmic erasers, removing everything that crosses their boundary from the observable universe forever. Or so everyone believed. By 1974, Stephen had established himself as one of the world's leading experts on black holes and general relativity. He had proven with Roger Penrose that singularities were inevitable features of gravitational collapse, not mathematical artifacts. He had shown that the universe itself emerged from a singularity. His work was rigorous, respected, foundational, but he was about to make a discovery that would shock the physics community and force a complete rethinking of what black holes actually are. The story begins with a seemingly simple question about entropy. In thermodynamics, entropy measures disorder, the tendency of organized systems to become disorganized over time. A broken glass has higher entropy than an intact one. A mixed cup of coffee and cream has higher entropy than the two liquids kept separate. The second law of thermodynamics states that entropy in a closed system always increases. Always. This is one of physics' most fundamental principles. But black holes presented a problem. If you threw something with high entropy into a black hole, the entropy seemed to disappear from the universe. The black hole grew slightly more massive, but it remained perfectly smooth, perfectly simple, described entirely by just three numbers: mass, spin, and electric charge. All the complex information about what fell in was gone. Entropy had decreased. The second law appeared to be violated. A young physicist named Jacob Bekenstein suggested a radical solution. What if black holes themselves have entropy? What if the entropy doesn't disappear but instead gets stored on the black hole's surface, on its event horizon? Most physicists dismissed this idea. How could a black hole have entropy? Entropy relates to disorder, to the number of ways a system can be arranged internally. Black holes have no internal structure. They're singularities surrounded by empty space. Bekenstein's proposal seemed to confuse a mathematical analogy with physical reality. Stephen thought Bekenstein was wrong. He set out to prove it. To understand what happened next, you need to know something about quantum mechanics, the physics that governs the very small. In quantum mechanics, empty space isn't actually empty. It seethes with virtual particles, matter and antimatter pairs that pop into existence for impossibly brief instants before annihilating each other. These quantum fluctuations are real, measurable effects that have been confirmed by countless experiments. Now imagine these quantum fluctuations occurring right at a black hole's event horizon, that boundary beyond which nothing escapes. Normally, particle-antiparticle pairs appear and quickly vanish. But at the event horizon, something remarkable can happen. One particle falls into the black hole while its partner escapes into space before they can reunite. Stephen began calculating what this process would look like using quantum field theory, the mathematical framework that describes how quantum particles behave. The mathematics was ferociously complex, requiring him to perform calculations entirely in his head, visualizing how quantum fields behaved in the curved space-time around a black hole. And then he found something impossible. The black hole was emitting radiation. Real particles were escaping from just outside the event horizon, carrying away energy. The black hole was glowing. Stephen checked his calculations again and again, certain he'd made an error. Black holes don't emit anything. That's their defining feature. That's why they're black. But the mathematics was unambiguous. A black hole with a mass of 1 solar mass would have a temperature of 6 times 10 to the minus 8 Kelvin. Incredibly cold, but not absolute zero. A smaller black hole would be hotter. A larger one would be colder. The radiation followed a perfect black body spectrum, the same type of thermal radiation emitted by any hot object, from a campfire to a star. Black holes weren't perfectly black. They glowed with what would come to be called Hawking radiation. This was revolutionary on multiple levels. First, it meant black holes could evaporate. They emitted energy, which meant they lost mass, which meant given enough time, they would vanish completely in a final explosion. Second, it proved Bekenstein right. Black holes did have entropy, proportional to the area of their event horizon. The entropy of a black hole equals 1/4 of its event horizon's area, measured in Planck units. That last sentence deserves unpacking. The Planck length is 10 to the minus 35 meters, the smallest meaningful distance in quantum physics. The event horizon of a solar mass black hole has an area of roughly 10 to the 78 Planck areas. Divide by 4, and that's its entropy. The number is staggering, larger than the entropy of the Sun or the Earth or anything we encounter in daily life. Third, and perhaps most profound, Hawking radiation unified quantum mechanics, general relativity, and thermodynamics in a single calculation. These 3 pillars of modern physics had existed mostly in isolation, each describing its own domain. Stephen's discovery showed they were deeply interconnected, that you couldn't fully understand any one of them without the others. When Stephen first presented his results at a conference in 1974, the reaction was skepticism bordering on disbelief. Distinguished physicists who had spent decades studying black holes simply couldn't accept that these objects emitted radiation. It violated everything they knew. But the mathematics was ironclad. Stephen had used standard, well-accepted equations of quantum field theory. He had made no unusual assumptions, no controversial leaps. He had simply calculated what quantum mechanics predicted would happen near a black hole's event horizon, and out came radiation. Over the following months and years, other physicists checked the calculation using different mathematical approaches. Everyone got the same answer: black holes emit radiation. The temperature depends inversely on mass. Hawking radiation was real. Consider the audacity of this discovery. Stephen had overturned decades of understanding using nothing but thought, nothing but equations manipulated in his mind, nothing but the power of mathematical reasoning applied to the universe's most extreme environments. He hadn't observed Hawking radiation directly. We still haven't. Black holes, the mass of stars or larger, emit radiation so faint it's utterly undetectable against the cosmic microwave background. But the physics community accepted it because the theory was too elegant, too mathematically sound, too inevitable to be wrong. Stephen had also made a famous bet with Kip Thorne, the Caltech physicist who would later win a Nobel Prize for detecting gravitational waves. The bet concerned whether Cygnus Zone, a strong X-ray source in the constellation Cygnus, was actually a black hole. Stephen bet that it wasn't. This seems strange. Stephen was the world's leading black hole expert. Why bet against their existence? He called it insurance. If black holes didn't exist, if his life's work studying them was built on fiction, at least he'd win the bet and get a subscription to Private Eye magazine. If black holes did exist, he'd lose the bet, but his scientific reputation would remain intact. Either way, he couldn't lose everything. Years later, as evidence mounted that Cygnus Zone was indeed a black hole, Stephen conceded the bet. Kip Thorne won a subscription to Penthouse magazine, which Stephen arranged somewhat awkwardly. But here's the deeper significance of Hawking radiation. It revealed that information might be destroyed in black holes after all, violating quantum mechanics' fundamental principle that information is conserved. When a black hole evaporates completely, Where does the information about everything that fell in go? Does it vanish from the universe? Does it emerge somehow encoded in the radiation? This information paradox would haunt Stephen for the next 30 years, driving him to reconsider his own discovery, to search for resolutions that preserved both quantum mechanics and general relativity. It would lead to heated debates, controversial proposals, and eventually a dramatic reversal of his original position. But in 1974, fresh from proving black holes weren't black, Stephen was riding high. He was 32 years old. He had survived more than a decade beyond his death sentence. His marriage to Jane was stable. His 3 children were healthy. His career was accelerating toward heights few physicists ever reach. He was elected one of the youngest fellows of the Royal Society at age 32, joining the ranks of Newton, Darwin, and Maxwell. The citation praised his remarkable results in his work on general relativity theory and its application to cosmology. In the understated language of scientific honors, this was extraordinary recognition for someone so young. The discovery of Hawking radiation marked a turning point. Before this, Stephen was a brilliant cosmologist working on important but somewhat abstract problems. After this, he became something rarer. A physicist whose work bridged multiple fields, who found connections others had missed, who changed how we understand reality at its most fundamental level. And he did it all while his body continued its slow betrayal. By the mid-70s, his speech had deteriorated to the point where only Jane and a few close colleagues could understand him. His wheelchair became more sophisticated as his mobility decreased. His hands could no longer turn pages or manipulate most objects. But none of this diminished the power of his mind. If anything, his isolation from physical activity intensified his focus on abstract thought. While other physicists filled blackboards with equations, Stephen constructed entire mathematical arguments in his head, holding complex calculations in memory for hours or days until he could convey the results to colleagues. This is what amazes me most about Stephen's work during this period. The discovery of Hawking radiation required manipulating some of the most sophisticated mathematics in physics, combining quantum field theory with general relativity in a regime where no one had successfully worked before. It required imagining processes occurring at scales and in conditions utterly unlike anything in human experience. And Stephen did it while unable to write, while barely able to communicate, while trapped in a failing body. The universe had given him a brilliant mind and then systematically removed every physical tool for expressing that brilliance except thought itself. And thought, it turned out, was enough. More than enough. Black holes weren't black. The universe's most perfect prisons leaked. Information and entropy and quantum mechanics and gravity were all connected in ways no one had imagined. And a man who couldn't write equations on paper had proven it all by seeing the mathematics in his mind's eye. The question now was, what else could he discover? What other secrets was the universe hiding, waiting for someone with the courage to look beyond what seemed obvious? Stephen's next decades would bring more discoveries, more honors, more recognition. But Hawking radiation remained his signature achievement, the work that transformed him from excellent physicist to legendary figure. It was proof that the human mind, at its finest, could grasp truths about the universe that no experiment could access, no telescope could observe. Sometimes, the only laboratory you need is thought itself. The voice you're born with seems inseparable from who you are. It carries your personality, your emotions, your regional accent, and family cadence. When you speak, you're not just transmitting information. You're expressing yourself in a way that's uniquely, irreducibly you. Stephen Hawking's natural voice had been fading for years. By the early 1980s, only Jane and a few close colleagues could understand his increasingly slurred speech. Conversations required patience and repetition. Lectures became collaborations, with students or assistants translating his words for larger audiences. But he could still speak. He could still make sounds that, with effort, conveyed meaning. And then, in the summer of 1985, even that was taken from him. Stephen was traveling in Switzerland when he contracted pneumonia. At 6,500 feet elevation in the Alps, his compromised respiratory system couldn't fight the infection. His condition deteriorated rapidly. He was rushed to a hospital in Geneva, where doctors faced an impossible choice. The pneumonia was blocking his airways. He needed a tracheotomy, a surgical opening in the throat to allow direct access to the windpipe. It would save his life, but it would also sever the connection between his lungs and vocal cords, making natural speech impossible forever. The doctors asked Jane to make the decision: her husband's life or his voice. She chose life. When Stephen woke from the surgery, he discovered he was alive, but silent. Completely, utterly silent. The disease had stolen his mobility, his physical independence, his ability to care for himself. Now it had stolen the one thing he could still do: speak his thoughts directly into the world. For a man whose life's work was ideas, whose career depended on communicating complex physics to students and colleagues, whose very identity was bound up in explaining the universe, this seemed like the final defeat. How could he lecture? How could he collaborate? How could he continue his work? The answer came from California. Walt Woltos was a computer programmer who had created a speech synthesizer program called Equalizer for a mother-in-law who had lost her voice to illness. The program allowed users to select words from a screen, building sentences that a synthetic voice would speak aloud. It wasn't elegant. It was slow, mechanical, nothing like natural speech. But it worked. When Woltosz heard about Stephen's situation, he donated the program without hesitation. He sent it to Cambridge along with a hardware synthesizer made by a company called Speech Plus. The setup was primitive by today's standards. A small computer mounted on Stephen's wheelchair, a screen showing words and common phrases, a handheld clicker that Stephen could use to select options. At first, Stephen could operate it with his hand, clicking through menus at a rate of about 15 words per minute. Later, as his hands lost even that minimal function, the system was adapted to work with a cheek muscle. A tiny infrared sensor detected the twitch, registering it as a click. With this single muscle, this millimeter of movement, Stephen could select letters, build words, construct sentences. The voice that emerged was unlike any human voice. It was flat, robotic, distinctly synthetic, with an American accent programmed into the DEC Talk synthesizer. Each word came out with identical emphasis, no rising inflection for questions, no emotional coloring, just pure information transmitted through artificial sound. Stephen could have upgraded later as technology improved. Newer synthesizers offered more natural voices, better intonation, even the possibility of a British accent. But he refused. "It has become my trademark," he said through that same synthetic voice. The robot tone, the American accent, the deliberate pace of his speech had become inseparable from his identity. People around the world could hear those sounds and immediately know that's Stephen Hawking. Consider the profound irony. Losing his natural voice made him more recognizable, more famous, more accessible to mass audiences than any physicist in history. The very limitation that should have ended his ability to communicate instead gave him a voice that transcended language barriers, that could be heard in lecture halls and on television, that became iconic. But the reality of using this system was exhausting. Imagine trying to have a conversation at 15 words per minute. A simple sentence takes 2 or 3 minutes to construct. A paragraph takes 10. A lecture requires hours of preparation, typing out every word in advance, because spontaneous responses are impossibly slow. Yet Stephen used this system to write A Brief History of Time. The book began as an attempt to explain cosmology to general readers, to share the excitement of discoveries about the universe's origins without requiring advanced mathematics. Publishers were skeptical. Popular science books rarely sold well. Physics books written for lay audiences typically reached a few thousand readers at most. Stephen had a larger vision. He wanted to reach everyone, not just the educated elite, but ordinary people curious about existence. He wanted to answer the big questions. Where did the universe come from? How did it begin? Will it end? Why does it exist at all? The writing process was torturous. Each word selected letter by letter, each sentence constructed over minutes, each chapter taking weeks. The whole book required several years of work that a writer with full mobility might complete in months. But the result was extraordinary. A Brief History of Time was published in 1988, and it became a phenomenon. It sold over 10 million copies worldwide. It remained on the London Sunday Times bestseller list for 237 weeks, more than 4 years. It was translated into dozens of languages. The book made Stephen Hawking a household name, not just among scientists, but everywhere. People who couldn't solve a basic equation bought it, read it, grappled with ideas about black holes and the Big Bang and the nature of time. The book democratized cosmology, made it accessible, proved that ordinary people could engage with the universe's deepest mysteries if someone explained them clearly enough. And the iconic voice, that synthesized monotone, became the instrument through which millions heard these ideas. Stephen gave lectures that were broadcast on television. He appeared on documentaries. Students around the world heard that distinctive voice explaining how black holes evaporate, how time might have a beginning, how the universe might be one of many. The Intel Corporation became deeply involved in maintaining Stephen's communication system. As technology evolved, they created custom hardware and software to keep pace with his declining mobility. When his hand could no longer click, they developed the cheek sensor. When his facial expressions became limited, they refined the sensitivity until a nearly imperceptible twitch could register. A team of engineers dedicated themselves to ensuring Stephen could continue communicating. They understood that his voice, artificial though it was, had become essential not just to him but to physics itself, to the public understanding of science, to millions of people for whom Stephen represented the power of human mind over physical limitation. By the 1990s, Stephen was communicating at about 2 to 3 words per minute. A single sentence could take 5 minutes. A brief conversation might consume an hour. Yet he continued lecturing, writing papers, collaborating with colleagues, explaining the universe to anyone who would listen. His patience was extraordinary. Imagine having a thought, a complete idea, fully formed in your brilliant mind, and needing 20 minutes to express it. Imagine someone asking a question and requiring 10 minutes just to begin your response. Most people would give up, retreat into silence, let others speak for them. Stephen never did. Every word mattered. Every sentence was carefully constructed. If communication required hours, he would spend hours. The difficulty made him more precise, more economical with language, more careful about what he chose to say. And paradoxically, the slowness created impact. When Stephen spoke, everyone listened. The long pauses became dramatic, building anticipation. The measured pace forced audiences to really hear each word, each idea. What might have been a limitation became a powerful rhetorical tool. His public appearances multiplied. He lectured at universities across the world. He appeared on television shows, bringing physics to audiences that never watched academic programming. He met with world leaders, celebrities, anyone curious about the universe. The wheelchair, the computer, the synthetic voice, became symbols of triumph over adversity. But let me be clear about something important. Stephen didn't want to be seen primarily as a disabled person overcoming obstacles. He wanted to be recognized as a physicist making discoveries. The wheelchair was simply how he moved. The synthesizer was simply how he spoke. What mattered was the science, the ideas, the quest to understand existence. "I try to lead as normal a life as possible," he said, "and not think about my condition or regret the things it prevents me from doing, which are not that many. Not that many." From a man who couldn't walk, couldn't eat without assistance, couldn't scratch an itch, or adjust his position, or perform any of the 1,000 tiny physical actions we do without thinking. Not that many. This is the perspective that defined Stephen's later life. Disability wasn't about what the body couldn't do. It was about whether the mind remained free. And Stephen's mind was utterly, completely free, ranging across the universe, grappling with infinity, asking questions that most people never imagine. The voice he lost in 1985 was replaced by something unprecedented. Not better, certainly. Not the same, but powerful in its own way, reaching further, speaking to more people, becoming more memorable than any natural voice could have been. Sometimes what we lose forces us to discover what we never knew we could gain. Sometimes limitation creates new possibilities. Sometimes silence, transformed through technology and determination, becomes the loudest voice in the world. And Stephen's voice, that distinctive synthetic sound, was just beginning to speak to the universe's most profound mysteries. Where does the universe end? It's a question that seems simple until you begin to think about it seriously. If space has an edge, what lies beyond that edge? More space? Nothing? And what would nothing even mean? For most of human history, we imagined the cosmos had clear boundaries. Ancient civilizations pictured a dome overhead, stars fixed to a celestial sphere. Later, we discovered galaxies stretching billions of light-years in every direction. But even an expanding universe must have started somewhere, must have boundaries in time if not in space. Stephen Hawking spent decades thinking about boundaries, not the physical barriers we encounter in daily life, but the mathematical edges of existence itself. What happens at the boundary of a black hole? What happened at the boundary called the Big Bang? Do these boundaries represent real edges to space-time, or are they artifacts of how we're thinking about the problem? In the early 1980s, Stephen began collaborating with Jim Hartle, a physicist at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Together, they asked a question that seemed almost philosophical. What if the universe has no boundary at all? This sounds contradictory. We know the universe had a beginning. We know it's been expanding for 13.8 billion years. We know that if you run time backward, everything converges to a singularity where density becomes infinite and physics breaks down. That singularity seems like the ultimate boundary, the edge before which nothing existed. But Stephen and Jim proposed something radical. What if we're thinking about time wrong? In quantum mechanics, physicists often use a mathematical trick called imaginary time. Don't be misled by the name. Imaginary time is a real mathematical concept, using imaginary numbers, where time behaves more like a spatial dimension. It's not the time we experience, that relentless forward march from past to future. It's a different way of thinking about temporal relationships that makes certain quantum calculations much easier. Stephen and Jim applied imaginary time to the entire universe. And in imaginary time, something remarkable happens. The singularity at the Big Bang smooths out. Instead of an infinite spike where physics breaks down, you get a smooth curve, like the South Pole on Earth. Think about Earth's surface. If you travel south from anywhere on the planet, you eventually reach the South Pole. But the South Pole isn't an edge. It's not a boundary beyond which there's nothing. It's just a point on a continuous surface. You can't go further south because south ceases to have meaning there, but the surface itself continues in other directions. The universe in imaginary time is like this. The Big Bang isn't an edge, but a smooth point, where time as we experience it begins. Before the Big Bang, there is no before. Not because time hits a wall, but because the concept of before ceases to apply. The universe has no boundary. Space and time simply are, like the surface of a sphere. This is the no-boundary proposal, and it's one of the most elegant ideas in cosmology. It resolves the paradox of creation by showing that creation itself is the wrong word. The universe doesn't need to be created because it has no edge, no beginning in the sense we usually imagine. It exists as a self-contained, four-dimensional space-time manifold. The mathematics supporting this idea is extraordinarily complex, involving path integrals over all possible geometries of space-time. Stephen couldn't write these equations on paper. He visualized them, held the geometric structures in his mind, communicated the essential insights to Jim Hartle, who would work out the detailed calculations. But the no-boundary proposal raised as many questions as it answered. If the universe has no boundary, does that mean it's eternal? Not quite. In real time, the time we experience, the universe still has a definite age, still began expanding 13.8 billion years ago. The no-boundary condition applies in imaginary time, in the mathematical framework that describes quantum origins. This might seem like cheating, using an abstract mathematical trick to avoid difficult questions. But in quantum mechanics, imaginary time isn't just a convenience. It's fundamental to how quantum fields behave, how probabilities are calculated, how the universe operates at its most basic level. While working on the universe's boundaries, Stephen was also wrestling with a problem that had emerged from his own discovery of black hole radiation: the information paradox. In quantum mechanics, information cannot be destroyed. If you know the exact state of a system at one moment, the laws of physics allow you to calculate its state at any other moment, forward or backward in time. Information is conserved absolutely. But black holes seem to violate this principle. When matter falls into a black hole, all information about that matter disappears behind the event horizon. And when the black hole eventually evaporates through Hawking radiation, the radiation appears to be completely random, carrying no information about what fell in. Where did the information go? Was it destroyed? If so, quantum mechanics was wrong. Was it preserved somehow? If so, how could information escape from inside the event horizon? Stephen initially argued that information was indeed destroyed, that black holes represented an exception to quantum mechanics' conservation laws. This position put him at odds with many physicists who insisted quantum mechanics was inviolable. The debate raged for decades. Conferences were held, papers were written, bets were made. Stephen defended his position vigorously, arguing that the mathematics of black hole evaporation clearly showed information loss. But by 2004, after 30 years of thinking about the problem, Stephen changed his mind. At a conference in Dublin, he announced he had been wrong. Information isn't destroyed in black holes. It emerges in the Hawking radiation, scrambled and difficult to decode, but theoretically recoverable. The technical details involved quantum corrections to the original calculation, subtle effects that preserved information even as it appeared to vanish. Stephen conceded his bet with John Preskill and Kip Thorne, awarding them an encyclopedia of their choice from which information could be recovered at will. It was a playful gesture, acknowledging a serious point. He had been wrong, and being wrong is part of how science progresses. During these same years, Stephen explored M-theory, an ambitious attempt to unify all forces and particles into a single mathematical framework. M-theory proposes that the universe has not 3 spatial dimensions but 11, with the extra dimensions compactified into shapes too small to observe directly. M-theory also predicts that our universe is one of perhaps 10 to the 500 possible variations, each with different physical laws, different constants, different properties. This vast landscape of possible universes raised profound questions. Why does our universe have the particular laws it does? Is there something special about our configuration? Or are we simply one random instance among countless others? Stephen's final major paper, submitted just 10 days before his death on March 4, 2018, addressed exactly this question. Working with Thomas Hertog, he argued that our universe isn't special or fine-tuned. It's typical, an ordinary example from the multiverse's infinite variations. The mathematics showed that universes like ours, capable of supporting complexity and life, aren't rare miracles but common outcomes of cosmic evolution. This was Stephen's last contribution to physics. Not a complete theory of everything, not a final answer to existence, but another step toward understanding, another boundary explored, another question refined, if not fully answered. Throughout all this theoretical work, remember the physical reality. Stephen was completely paralyzed, communicating through cheek twitches at 2 or 3 words per minute, dependent on round-the-clock care for every basic need. Yet his mind ranged freely across 11-dimensional spacetimes, quantum fluctuations at the Planck scale, the infinite landscape of possible universes. The contrast is staggering. A body that couldn't move contained a mind that explored infinity. This is what strikes me most about Stephen's later work. The theories became increasingly abstract, increasingly removed from anything we can observe or test directly. The no-boundary proposal, the information paradox, the landscape of M-theory. These aren't questions we can resolve with experiments or observations, at least not with current technology. They're questions we can only explore through pure thought, through mathematical reasoning, through the mind's ability to imagine possibilities beyond physical experience. And Stephen's mind, freed from the distraction of physical activity, freed from the ability to move, gesture, or physically manipulate anything, became purely abstract. He lived almost entirely in thought, in the realm of ideas and equations and geometric intuitions. Perhaps this is why he saw so far. Perhaps this is why he asked questions others didn't think to ask. When your only tool is thought, you learn to use that tool with extraordinary precision and power. The boundaries of everything, the edge of black holes, the beginning of time, the limits of knowledge itself. Stephen spent his career approaching these boundaries, poking at them, testing whether they were real barriers or just failures of imagination. And again, he found that what seemed like edges were actually continuous, that what seemed like endings were just transitions to different ways of understanding. The universe has no boundary. Information isn't lost. Time itself might be an illusion of perspective. These ideas remain controversial, incomplete, subject to debate and refinement, but they represent something essential about the scientific spirit. The refusal to accept that any question is unanswerable, the determination to push understanding as far as thought can reach, the courage to imagine that reality might be stranger and more beautiful than we dare to believe. Stephen's work on boundaries showed that the biggest barriers we face are often the ones we construct in our own thinking, the limits we accept without questioning. When we dare to ask what lies beyond, we often discover there is no beyond, only different perspectives on the same continuous existence. The universe, it seems, is boundless, and so, it turns out, is the human capacity to understand it. Gravity is relentless. Every moment of every day, it pulls at us, anchors us to Earth, reminds our bodies that we are bound to this planet's surface. For most of us, this is simply reality, barely noticed except when we stumble or climb stairs. For Stephen Hawking, gravity was a prison. His wheelchair weighed him down. His paralyzed limbs hung uselessly. His head required support to stay upright. Everything about his physical existence was a constant negotiation with gravity's pull, a battle his body had long since lost. On April 26, 2007, at age 65, Stephen Hawking escaped. A modified Boeing 727 took off from Florida, carrying Stephen and a team of doctors, nurses, and companions. The plane, operated by Zero Gravity Corporation, flew in parabolic arcs designed to create brief periods of weightlessness. At the top of each arc, for about 25 seconds, gravity disappeared. Stephen was strapped carefully into his wheelchair as the plane climbed steeply, engines roaring. Then, at the peak, the pilot pushed the nose down, following a precise ballistic trajectory. The plane and everything inside it entered free fall together, and Stephen floated. For the first time in decades, perhaps for the first time since childhood, his body was free. No weight pressing him into the chair, no gravity pulling his limbs down, no anchoring force reminding him of his limitations. He floated in the cabin, supported gently by handlers, a huge smile visible on his face. They performed 8 parabolas that day, 8 separate periods of weightlessness. Each time, Stephen experienced something most people never will. Absolute physical freedom, the sensation of weightlessness that astronauts describe as transcendent. "Space, here I come," he said through his synthesizer afterward, his characteristic humor mixing with genuine joy. The event was more than a personal triumph. It was a demonstration that disability need not prevent anyone from experiencing extraordinary things. It was Stephen showing the world, one more time, that limitation is a matter of perspective. It was a 65-year-old man with complete paralysis, proving that human spirit and determination can overcome almost anything. But this was just one example of how Stephen had transformed from physicist into cultural icon. In 1993, he appeared on Star Trek: The Next Generation, playing himself in a poker game with holographic versions of Albert Einstein, Isaac Newton, and the android Data. The scene is delightful. Stephen's synthesized voice delivers lines with perfect comic timing, his presence adding authenticity and humor to a show beloved by science enthusiasts. He appeared on The Simpsons multiple times, his wheelchair equipped with increasingly absurd modifications, his synthesizer delivering jokes that poked fun at his own situation. In one episode, he uses his wheelchair's robotic arm to steal a lollipop from a baby. In another, he transforms his wheelchair into a helicopter and flies away. This was Stephen's genius for public engagement. He didn't take himself too seriously. He understood that humor made science accessible, that appearing on popular television shows reached audiences who would never read physics papers or attend academic lectures. His celebrity grew beyond anything most scientists experience. He met Pope John Paul II and discussed cosmology. He met Queen Elizabeth II and received royal honors. He lectured to audiences of thousands who came not because they understood general relativity, but because they wanted to be in the presence of someone extraordinary. On June 28, 2009, Stephen threw a party for time travelers. He sent out invitations afterward, advertising coordinates in space-time where the party had occurred. The invitation read, "You are cordially invited to a reception for time travelers," followed by the exact date, time, and location. No one came. Stephen sat alone in the room, champagne and balloons prepared, waiting for visitors from the future. Their absence proved, he argued playfully, that backward time travel is impossible, or at least that time travelers have poor social skills or choose not to reveal themselves. It was classic Stephen, taking a serious scientific question about causality and time travel, and turning it into a public experiment with champagne and humor, making physics fun, making people think. But let me tell you about the personal side of these years, because Stephen's life wasn't just public triumph. His marriage to Jane ended in divorce in 1995, after 30 years together. The strain of being both wife and caregiver, of raising 3 children while managing Stephen's increasingly complex medical needs, had become unsustainable. Stephen married his nurse, Elaine Mason, later that year. This second marriage lasted 11 years before it too ended in divorce in 2006. Relationships are difficult enough without the complications of complete physical dependence, constant medical interventions, worldwide fame. His children, Robert, Lucy, and Timothy, grew up with a father who couldn't throw a ball or help with homework in conventional ways, but who could share the universe's deepest mysteries. Lucy became a journalist and author, writing science books for children with her father's input. Robert pursued business. Timothy studied languages. All 3 remained devoted to their father, despite the unusual circumstances of their childhood. Stephen insisted on independence wherever possible. He traveled constantly, giving lectures across continents despite the logistical nightmares of moving a completely paralyzed person with sophisticated medical equipment. He refused to let his condition limit his engagement with the world. His sense of humor remained sharp. When asked about his IQ, he replied, "I have no idea. People who boast about their IQ are losers." When asked if he believed in God, he gave answers that were thoughtful but unambiguous in their atheism, seeing no need for divine intervention to explain the universe's existence. He worried about humanity's future. He calculated that we had perhaps 1,000 years left on Earth before we must colonize other planets or face extinction. Climate change, nuclear war, artificial intelligence, asteroid impacts. He saw numerous threats to our species' survival. Particularly artificial intelligence concerned him. He warned repeatedly that AI could be the best or worst thing ever to happen to humanity. If we developed it wisely, it could solve problems beyond human capability. If we developed it carelessly, it could decide it doesn't need humans at all. These weren't the warnings of a technophobe. Stephen understood AI's potential better than most, having used computer systems to communicate for decades. But he also understood exponential growth, feedback loops, the possibility of systems becoming more intelligent than their creators and pursuing goals incompatible with human survival. Through all of this, through celebrity and divorce and travel and warnings about the future, Stephen continued doing physics, continued publishing papers, continued asking questions. The public appearances never became more important than the science. The fame never distracted from the fundamental quest to understand existence. He received countless honors: the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Barack Obama, the Copley Medal from the Royal Society, dozens of honorary degrees from universities worldwide. His face became instantly recognizable, his voice iconic, his story inspiring to millions who faced their own limitations. But ask Stephen what he was most proud of, and he would talk about his scientific work: the singularity theorems, Hawking radiation, the no-boundary proposal. These were his real achievements, the contributions that would outlast celebrity, the ideas that changed how we understand reality. The zero-gravity flight in 2007 was magnificent, a moment of physical freedom in a life defined by physical constraint. But it was also symbolic. Stephen had been floating free in imagination for decades, his mind ranging across the universe while his body remained anchored to Earth. The plane's parabolic arc just made visible what had always been true: that gravity could hold his body but never his mind. That physical limitation meant nothing when thought could travel to black holes and the Big Bang and the multiverse beyond. "Look up at the stars and not down at your feet," Stephen said in one of his most famous quotes. Try to make sense of what you see and wonder about what makes the universe exist. Be curious. This was his message to the world. Not about overcoming disability, though his life demonstrated that powerfully. Not about achieving fame or recognition, though he achieved both, but about curiosity, about wonder, about the human capacity to ask questions and seek answers regardless of circumstance. The boy who couldn't read until age 8. The young man given 2 years to live. The physicist who lost his voice. The completely paralyzed man floating weightless in an airplane, grinning with pure joy. All the same person. All the same unstoppable spirit. All the same determination to understand everything. Space. Here I come. Indeed. We are all made of stardust. This isn't poetry or metaphor. It's literal truth. The carbon in our cells, the iron in our blood, the calcium in our bones, all of it was forged in the nuclear furnaces of ancient stars that lived, burned, and died billions of years ago. We are the universe examining itself, atoms arranged in patterns complex enough to contemplate their own origins. On March 14th, 2018, some of those atoms stopped contemplating. It was Einstein's birthday. It was Pi Day, that mathematical holiday celebrating the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter. And it was the day Stephen Hawking's 76-year journey through space-time came to an end. He died peacefully at his home in Cambridge, surrounded by family. His children, Lucy, Robert, and Timothy, released a statement. "We are deeply saddened that our beloved father passed away today. He was a great scientist and an extraordinary man whose work and legacy will live on for many years." The final words Stephen tried to communicate were lost. His nurse couldn't interpret the signals from his communication system. Whatever thought occupied his mind in those last moments remained unexpressed, locked away as his consciousness dissolved back into the universe from which it had emerged. Think about what this means. A man who spent decades communicating at 2 or 3 words per minute, who crafted every sentence with painstaking care, who made every word count because words were so difficult to produce. His final message was silence. Perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps there are thoughts beyond words, experiences beyond language. Perhaps at the end, there's simply awareness without the need for expression. The world mourned. Tributes poured in from scientists, celebrities, political leaders, and ordinary people who had been inspired by his story. His passing was front-page news globally, not just in science journals, but in every major newspaper, every news broadcast, every corner of the internet. Westminster Abbey announced he would be interred there, his ashes placed between Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin. Think about that placement. 3 men who transformed human understanding. Newton revealed the laws governing motion and gravity. Darwin revealed the mechanism of life's diversity. Stephen revealed the quantum nature of black holes and the origin of the universe itself. At the memorial service on June 15th, 2018, astronaut Tim Peake read from Isaiah. Professor Faye Dowker spoke about Stephen's physics. His daughter Lucy read from his work, and through speakers throughout the Abbey, Stephen's synthesized voice delivered words he had recorded years earlier about the human spirit's refusal to be constrained. But something else happened that day, something beautiful and strange. The European Space Agency transmitted Stephen's voice toward the nearest black hole, Sagittarius A star, at the center of our galaxy. The signal traveled at light speed, carrying his words about hope and wonder and humanity's potential across 26,000 light-years of space. It will arrive at that black hole in about 26,000 years. And then, if Stephen's own theories are correct, his voice will be absorbed by the event horizon, its information scrambled into Hawking radiation, eventually re-emerging in some unrecognizable form billions of years from now, when the black hole finally evaporates. His voice, traveling to the very objects he spent his life studying. His words, destined to fall into the gravitational abyss he proved wasn't quite so absolute. There's a profound poetry in this, a completion of the circle between scientist and subject. But Stephen's real legacy isn't in transmissions to black holes or ashes in Westminster Abbey. It's in the ideas he left behind, the questions he taught us to ask, the perspective he gave us on existence. His equations continue solving themselves in universities and research institutions worldwide. Students who weren't born when he lost his voice now use his theories to explore the universe. The singularity theorems remain fundamental to cosmology. Hawking radiation remains the bridge between quantum mechanics and gravity. The no-boundary proposal continues inspiring new approaches to quantum cosmology. He predicted we have roughly 1,000 years before humanity must leave Earth or face extinction. Whether that timeline is accurate or not, the underlying point remains vital. We are fragile. Our planet is fragile. If we want our species to survive long-term, we must become a spacefaring civilization. He warned about artificial intelligence with increasing urgency in his final years, not from fear of technology, but from understanding its exponential potential. He saw AI as humanity's greatest opportunity and greatest risk, depending entirely on how wisely we develop it. He believed in the power of science to answer questions that philosophy and religion had debated for millennia. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Where are we going? Stephen thought these questions had physical answers, mathematical answers, answers we could discover through observation and reason. And yet he never claimed to have all the answers. His work raised as many questions as it resolved. The information paradox remains debated. The nature of singularities remains mysterious. The possibility of a multiverse remains speculative. Stephen would have wanted it this way. Science isn't about final answers, but about better questions, deeper understanding, the endless pursuit of truth. Consider what he accomplished against impossible odds. Diagnosed at 21 with 2 years to live, he survived 55 more. Paralyzed completely, he revolutionized physics. Unable to write or speak naturally, he became science's greatest communicator. Limited to a wheelchair, his mind traveled to the edge of the universe and beyond. This is Stephen's ultimate message. That limitation is negotiable, that the human spirit transcends physical constraint, that curiosity and determination can overcome almost anything. He wasn't superhuman. He struggled with depression after his diagnosis. His marriages failed. He could be difficult, demanding, impatient with those who didn't think as quickly as he did. He was human, flawed, complex. But he was also extraordinary. Not because of his disability, but despite it. Not because overcoming physical limitation made him special, but because his mind genuinely operated at a level few humans ever reach. The wheelchair and synthesizer were just context for the real story, which was always about ideas, discoveries, understanding. Young people diagnosed with ALS today still face a devastating prognosis. Medical science hasn't found a cure. Most patients still die within a few years. Stephen's survival was an anomaly, not a promise. But his example shows that even in the face of terminal diagnosis, life can have profound meaning and purpose. Parents of disabled children see in Stephen proof that physical limitation doesn't determine human potential. Students struggling with subjects that don't come easily remember that Stephen couldn't read until age 8. Anyone facing seemingly insurmountable obstacles can look at his life and think, if he could do that, what's stopping me? On that March morning when Stephen's consciousness ended, the atoms that had formed his body began their next journey. Some would return to soil, some would evaporate into air, some would eventually scatter across the planet, becoming part of new structures, new patterns, new arrangements of matter. The atoms that had briefly organized themselves into a pattern capable of understanding black holes and the Big Bang returned to simpler forms. But the understanding itself persists, encoded in books and papers and the minds of those he taught and inspired. We are stardust contemplating stars. Stephen Hawking spent his life proving this connection, showing how the same laws that govern collapsing stars also govern quantum particles, how the same forces that created galaxies also shape atoms, how everything is connected in one grand, elegant, mathematical universe. He was born exactly 300 years after Galileo died, both men transforming how humanity sees the cosmos despite physical limitation. He lived during the era when we first left Earth, first looked back and saw our planet as a fragile blue marble in the void. He witnessed the discovery of gravitational waves, the detection of the Higgs boson, the observation of galaxies at the universe's edge. What a time to be alive! What a time to ask questions! What a time to discover that black holes aren't black, that time had a beginning, that the universe might be one of infinite variations in an endless multiverse. Stephen once said, "However difficult life may seem, there is always something you can do and succeed at. It matters that you don't just give up." He never gave up, not when diagnosed with terminal illness, not when he lost mobility, not when he lost his voice, not when every physical system failed except his mind. He kept working, kept discovering, kept explaining, kept inspiring until the very end. The boy who was given 2 years to live instead gave humanity 55 years of genius. The man who couldn't speak became the most recognizable voice in science. The physicist trapped in a wheelchair showed us that the only real prison is the one we build in our own minds. Look up at the stars, he told us. Wonder about what makes the universe exist. Be curious. And somewhere in the cosmos, his voice is still traveling toward a black hole, carrying that message into the darkness, proving one final time that even light cannot entirely escape the gravity of an extraordinary mind.